All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. I am back for a brand new solo episode of the show. Just me today, talking about some issues that I've unearthed in my research for this book. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the book today because I'm sure you're sick and tired of hearing me talk about it in all of the intros to every show that I have done over the course of the summer. So we're not gonna do that. But I have unearthed something that I never really noticed before in the Gospels that has to do with the Christological identity of Jesus. And when we're talking about Christology, obviously the word Christology sounds like Christ. So it's literally the study of the identity of Jesus as Christ. So there are in both theological circles and in biblical studies circles all kinds of debates about the nature of Jesus, about the identity of Jesus, about when the earliest Christians began believing that he was somehow associated with God, whether or not they believed that he was the king of Israel and the Messiah, what those terms mean. And all of those ideas are kind of wrapped up in Christology. Now, I do think that the most fundamental confession for the earliest Christians, at least in the New Testament, is the confession that Jesus is Lord. This is Romans 10:9. If you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, then you will be saved. This is kind of like the thing that denotes whether one has the kind of faith that makes them a member of God's covenant community, that makes them a member of Abraham's family. So this is really foundational for the entire New Testament. And it's something that regardless of what you think about the dating for the Gospels, how they were composed, where they got their sources from, it is impossible to deny that all four writers of the Gospels believed that Jesus was the Christ, the King of Israel, and that for them this wasn't a dead metaphor. And there have been some biblical scholars over the course of the last 200 years that have tried to argue that the term Christ doesn't actually mean anything, but it's almost impossible to read. No, it literally is impossible to read the Gospels without drawing the conclusion that the evangelists believed that Jesus was the Christ. And people would do that with Paul as well. And I mean, even like one of my favorite biblical scholars of all time, James Dunn, he, in some of his works, kind of went back and forth on whether or not the title Christ was a messianic title for Paul or whether it just kind of denoted Jesus as an individual. And I disagree with that. I think that every time that Paul uses the term Christ, he is evoking Jesus's messianic status. Now, there are a couple of issues that we got to discuss before we get into the heart of what I'm trying to communicate today. But I think that really what I'm trying to get at is that you can look at the way that the Gospels were written and come to the conclusion that Jesus is the actual King of Israel, which means, according to the Old Testament prophecies, that Jesus is king over the entire earth and that there are no competitors and no challengers. When the writers of the Bible talk about Jesus's kingship, they don't just mean that he's the king in some spiritual sense, like Jesus is the king of my heart or he's the king of the church, but they really do believe that in line with all of the prophecies, I think of Daniel chapter 7, I think of 2 Samuel chapter 7, Psalm 72, Psalm 2, it's all over the Old Testament, Jeremiah 30 through 33, all of these great passages in the Old Testament. Oh, another great one, Isaiah 9 through 11. There are all of these great prophetic passages in the Old Testament that look forward to the day when God will restore the Davidic monarchy and that Davidic monarchy will rule over all creation. And of course, when they apply and by they, the writers of the New Testament, when they apply these terms to Jesus, they mean exactly that. Now, I also believe as a Christian that they mean more than that. And I think that from very early on, including like the letters of Paul, which were written, just a couple of decades after Jesus's death and resurrection, I think Christians are coming to the conclusion that Jesus is more than just the Davidic Messiah. He might actually be identified with God Himself. Now, one of the unfortunate things that's happened in Christian history, and I've talked about this several times on the show before, is that in the fourth and fifth centuries, you have all of these kind of these great Christological controversies in the early church, where these not predominantly at this point, pretty much entirely the Greco-Roman leaders of the church, not there were very few, if any, Jewish leaders at that time, but the leaders of the church in the fourth and fifth centuries were predominantly steeped in Greco-Roman philosophy. And so the questions that they were asking about the nature of Jesus' identity weren't the Jewish questions about whether or not he was the Davidic Messiah. They were questions about his ontology, about to what extent is Jesus God, or to what extent does Jesus relate to God. And I largely come to the same conclusion that the writers of the Niceno-Constantinopolitan Creed come to, that there is an ontological relationship between Jesus the Son, God the Father, and the Holy Spirit. I don't think that that's fully present in the New Testament. I think the seeds are all there, but I don't think it's fully articulated as such. But I do believe that Jesus is divine, and I think that you can see that in places in Paul, like Romans 9:5 is a great example. 1 Corinthians 8, I think 4-6 is another good example. That Philippians 2:5-11, and then another big one is Colossians 1:15-20. So you can go and read those passages, and it's pretty clear that Paul is identifying Jesus with God in some profound way. But one of the unfortunate things that took place in the 4th and 5th century Christological debates, that Paul certainly is not guilty of doing, and that the writers of the Gospels are not guilty of doing, is that once the church established that Jesus was in some sense ontologically divine, they tended to remove all of the Jewish categories of Jesus's like political messianic identity. Now, of course, by this time, Constantine wins the Battle of Milvian Bridge in 312, and from that point on, Christianity was a legitimate religion, a legal religion in Rome, and its fate was kind of tied up with the fate of the Roman Empire. So it was very convenient from the early 4th century onward for Christians to kind of ignore or downplay the political consequences of the messianic identity of Jesus. Like, if Jesus is king, he's king over the entire world, but that obviously is a problem for political leaders who want to retain their own control and power. And so it's very clear to me that there were incentives going into the late ancient early medieval period for the church to kind of downplay the messianic emphasis that's clearly there in the New Testament. Jesus is without a doubt the Messiah. And even though people like Paul are going to push that messianic identity further than like any of the Old Testament prophets necessarily did, they never forgot that Jesus was the Davidic king. Like, that was the presupposition, and everything else was built off of that. Like, Jesus is the son of David who rules over the entire world. And whatever we say about his ontological relationship with God, it flows from that, right? So Jesus's Christological identity is the starting point for every other affirmation that we have about Christ. And I think I noticed a dynamic in the Gospels that kind of proves that point in a way that I had never noticed before. And so I want to go through in like the next 20 or 30 minutes. I want to go through that and just kind of work it out with you. Again, this is something that I have written a section on this in my book. I kind of reviewed it before I'm doing this, but this is an idea that I'm playing around with in my head, and something that I plan on doing more research and more work on in the future once I'm done writing this book and can start emphasizing or focusing on other aspects of the New Testament in my personal life, which I'm kind of excited to get to that point. But anyways, that's beside the point. So basically, where I'm going to start with this is that I had James Barker on my show earlier in the year to talk about his book, and I cannot for the life of me remember the title right now. In fact, let me look that up. I'm sorry, you guys are going to have to watch me staring into the camera here, but the book was so good. I just have read so many lately that I'm forgetting some of the titles of them. So let me see here. Barker's book is called sorry, this is taking so long here. It is called, oh yes, Writing and Rewriting the Gospels. All right, I love the book. It was incredible. He had a really fun interview, and I'll post a link to that in the show notes. You should definitely listen to that one if you haven't already, because that'll make sense of what I'm about to say in this episode. But essentially, the way that gospel scholarship has worked over the last 200 or so years is that there have been two predominant theories for the question that we call the synoptic problem. And the synoptic problem is the question of the literary relationship between Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the synoptic gospels. And they're called the synoptic gospels because the word synoptic comes from two Greek terms meaning seen and with. And if you've ever read Mark, Matthew, and Luke, you know that there's a lot of material that the three of these gospels have in common that's not found in John. These gospels are very similar in a lot of ways. And so from the earliest church onward, everyone has recognized that there is some kind of literary relationship between these three gospels. They're so close and they share so many of the same stories and so many of the same wordings that it would have been impossible for the three of them to develop independently. Like, there's no way that Matthew, Mark, and Luke all wrote these three gospels without, one of them knowing the others, right? They're just too close. So there has to be some sort of a literary relationship between these three gospels. And the question of that literary relationship is called the Synoptic problem. And I read a book by a scholar named Alan Kirk for the show a couple of years ago, who had an entire book that reviewed the history of the Synoptic problem. It's a long title. I'm not going to remember the name. He actually declined to come on the show, but he gave me a really good excuse for it. His reason was that he just thought that this was way too complicated for a lay audience, and if he ever wrote a popular level version of it, he'd love to talk with me. And I totally respect that, because it was a hard book for even like me to hold on to, and I've been studying this stuff for a long time. It was a thick book, right? But essentially, there have been two ways that scholars have addressed this, two kind of mainstream ways in the last 50 or 60 years of scholarship that scholars have tried to resolve the synoptic problem. And the first is the two source or the two document hypothesis. Now, one of the greatest discoveries of 19th century New Testament scholarship was the idea that Mark was the first gospel to be written. We call this Markan priority. So Mark is the first of the gospels to be written, and Matthew and Luke both use Mark as a source. Now, once the theory of Markan priority was discovered, the scholars had to come up with a way to explain all of the material that was common to Matthew and Luke that was not found in Mark. And as it turns out, a lot of that material is sayings material. So these are like sayings or teachings of Jesus that are found in Matthew and Luke, and oftentimes they're like very verbally similar, but they're not found in Mark. And so the idea that developed out of that was called the two document hypothesis. So what the two document hypothesis stipulates or speculates about the synoptic problem is that Matthew and Luke both use Mark as a common source, but then there must have been some other written source full of sayings material that both Matthew and Luke appealed to as well, which would explain all of the sayings material that Matthew and Luke have in common that aren't found in Mark. And this is called the two document hypothesis, because the two documents that Matthew and Luke used were Mark and the sayings document. And the title that was given to the sayings document was Quelle, which is the German word for source. And so that's been shortened to Q. And so if you've ever read any gospel scholarship, you will, especially if you read like an introductory book on the gospels, they'll talk about this Q document. And Q is the title that we use for this hypothetical saying source that apparently, based on this theory, Matthew and Luke both used along with Mark in order to construct their gospels. Now, this two source theory caught on like wildfire in New Testament scholarship, and there for a time it was the dominant theory, kind of like the unquestioned consensus in scholarship. But all of that began to change in the 1950s. There were some scholars like Michael Golder and Austin Farrer who began, and I think Farrer published first, because it's called the alternative is called the Farrer theory. But there were some scholars. It's Farrer, I think, wrote in the 50s, and maybe Golder in the 1970s. You can go back and check me on that. I think Barker talks about that a little bit in our episode, and some other gospel scholars I've had on have discussed this as well. But essentially in the 1950s, there were some scholars that began to realize that there were problems with the Q theory, namely that no one had ever actually found this document Q, and that it was not attested to in any ancient literature. Like none of the early church fathers ever mentioned this sayings document, and it had never been uncovered before. So there was just like no hard historical evidence that Q even existed. It was just an inference that was made about this hypothetical document that both Matthew and Luke used as they were constructing their gospels. And of course, along with that came the assumption, and this was kind of a revision of, there were other scholars before this that thought that maybe there wasn't this mysterious second document, but this came along with another idea that, well, like, why, if all three gospels are so close, okay, so maybe Matthew used Mark, or maybe Luke used Mark, and then maybe Matthew knew the other two, or maybe Luke knew Mark and Matthew. And so why do we have to postulate the existence of this hypothetical document for which there's no evidence at all, historically or literarily or anything? Why couldn't we just say, well, maybe given the fact that Mark was the first one, right, maybe Matthew copied Mark, and then maybe Luke copied both of them and just made some changes to fit his own thesis. And so with that, you have the birth of what is called the Farrer theory. And this is the big alternative to the two document hypothesis. And Austin Farrer is going to suggest that Mark was the first gospel to be written, followed by Matthew, who is then followed by Luke. And that's the order of the it's the order of the synoptic problem. And so, just in the same way that Matthew edited Mark as his source material and added some material and rearranged some material and kind of topically organized some material, Luke did the same thing. He knew both Matthew and Mark, and he just rearranged all of the material to kind of suit his own rhetorical needs. And that was where he got his sources from. No hypothetical document needed, and it explains the relationship between all three gospels. And so for the last, really since the 1950s, it's these two propositions that have been the predominant paradigm for the synoptic problem. And I think really the best modern advocate for the Farrer theory after Michael Golder is Mark Goodacre, who, fingers crossed, he's got a new book coming out this fall. Eerdmans is going to be sending me a copy to it. I have dreamed since the day I started this podcast about having Mark Goodacre on my show, and he's got a new book where he talks about this. So I'm really hoping I know Eerdmans is going to give me the copy. I'm hoping that he'll come on and talk to me. That would be incredible. But Mark Goodacre is the number one proponent of the Farrer theory. He's done by far more than anyone else in promoting it. And I remember, I read a couple of his articles when I was in college, and he has a podcast called the NT Pod, which I've repped on the show before. Phenomenal podcast. Highly recommend that. Absolutely everybody check that out. It's so good. And he deals with, especially in the older episodes, a lot of these issues related to the synoptic problem. And like by listening to all of these episodes that Goodacre published, I became convinced that the Farrer theory was correct, that this was absolutely the right answer to the question of the literary relationship between the synoptic gospels, because he did just a great job of breaking down the idea that this Q document existed. And so I really loved and appreciate his work. And so I became convinced, about 15 years ago by reading his articles and listening to his podcast that the Farrer theory is correct. And I've only been, I guess, more hardened in that theory over the last 15 years. So enter James Barker's book, and James Barker is he's definitely a proponent of the Farrer theory. He does not believe in the true document hypothesis, and he comes up with a theory that of what he calls synoptic trajectories. So essentially what this does is that it begins with the Gospel of Mark, and then it takes a look at the way in which Matthew could have utilized and reworked Mark's source material. And then it looks at the way that Luke reworks both of the previous Gospels. And you can kind of see that if you look at it, if you look at there being kind of a line from Matthew through Luke, then you can kind of clearly see why Matthew would, rationally reorganize Mark's material, and then why, of course, Luke would do the same thing with Matthew's. And so he has this idea of trajectories where you start with Mark, go all the way through Luke, and you can kind of see that if you look at it from that vantage point, how each gospel reworked the one that came before them. And I really found his theory provocative and correct, and I would highly recommend going and listening to that episode on the show. It's really hot in here, and I don't even, does this fan work? No, sure doesn't. Okay, so I'm just going to be hot. That's all right. But he talks about this on the episode where he goes even further than that. And he argues that John actually knows all three of the synoptic gospels, that John himself was aware that of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. He used all three of them as a source, and that he was engaging in a literary technique which is popular in the ancient world called oppositio and imitato. And that is where you use a source, like you use a particular source, and then you rewrite it in such a way that it's totally different stylistically than the original source, but it retains all of the ideas, or all of the, kind of the substance of that original work. And he argues that the Gospel of John is an example of oppositio and imitato. And I completely agree with that analysis. It makes so much sense of the evidence, both of the Farrer theory of the synoptic problem, and then also of John's relationship to the synoptics. And I, for a long time, believed that John knew the synoptics and was just trying to do something different with them. I also had Craig Blomberg on my show to talk about that earlier in the year, where he discussed, kind of the way that this all works. And I'll put a link to that episode in the show as well. All right, I'm going to take a quick break, and I'm going to turn on this fan. I'm going to edit this for the podcast here. Okay, I am back. Sorry about that. I am working on my wife's office, which is very small upstairs. And for whatever reason, it gets super hot. So I had to go turn on the air conditioning, and I have a fan that is pointed directly at me now. So I'm much more comfortable. I was like sweating through my shirt there. So, anyways, I apologize for the break. I'm sure it's going to be fun for you guys that are watching this on YouTube to see all of it. Anyways, so what we have here, we're back to talking about the Gospels, right? So I was talking about how I'm a big proponent of the FAR theory, not the two document hypothesis. And I really do believe that James Barker's idea of synoptic trajectories that extend not just through Luke, but also into Mark is fundamentally correct. And there are so many, especially after, as I've been kind of reading through all four of the Gospels together, there are just so many ways in which I can see how, based on Barker's theory, John was creatively reworking his material in the Gospels. It's brilliant. And again, if this is all like kind of new to you, I would go back and listen to a bunch of the New Quest episodes that I did. I think that that's going to be really helpful to, kind of better understand these dynamics in the Gospels. But what I really wanted to focus on in this episode was one instance where I see these kind of synoptic trajectories that run through John actually at play. And this has to do with the issue of Jesus's Christology, and in particular, his divine identity. And I think that there is kind of a clear development from Mark through Matthew to Luke, and then all the way into John. Now, one of the things that I'm not going to be arguing for is what like some of the liberal theologians or the more critical biblical scholars will argue, is that what I'm absolutely not saying is that the very developed Christology in John is somehow at odds with Mark's gospel. I don't think that at all. I think that we do get more like theological and Christological development as we go from the earliest gospel to the latest one, but none of the later gospels contradict what their source says. And if they didn't like what their source said about Jesus, then they probably wouldn't have utilized them as a source anyway. So we do see differences between the four gospels, but they're differences of development. They're not removing anything that the previous gospel writer said. They're building on top of that and making dynamics in the earlier gospels that are maybe more implicit in the text, that are maybe not as obvious. They're making those more obvious. And one of the ways that I see this happening in all four gospels is with the concept of the beginning of Jesus's ministry. Now, given that Mark is the very first gospel writer to write, the first line of the first gospel, so Mark 1:1 reads like this. It says, "The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God." There's a lot that's built into that passage right there. Now, from the start of Mark, there is a very, very, very clear affirmation of Jesus's identity as the Messiah, the King of Israel. These terms, Christ and Son of God, both denote in Second Temple Judaism a messianic Davidic figure. These were titles that would be applied to the coming Jewish Messiah. And as Mark opens up his gospel, he says from the very beginning that Jesus is the Christ. He's the Christos, the anointed one, the promised son of David, who is the Son of God. Now, again, there are plenty of places, and Psalm 2 is kind of the classic example of this. 2 Samuel 7 is another good example as well, where the Son of God is identified with the Davidic king. Now, in Psalm chapter 2, the Son of God doesn't necessarily denote somebody who's like ontologically or physically God's son. I don't see there being any indication in that text, and in 2 Samuel 7, where it comes from, where the promised Davidic king will be God's son. I don't see any indication that they mean that in a specifically ontological sense. What they mean is that the king is the representative of God's here on earth. It's not the same substance as God, but he represents God. So this is an elevated figure. This is a royal figure in Psalm 2. The royal figure that God will anoint will wind up ruling over all of creation and crushing all of Israel's enemies. And so when Mark employs terms like anointed one, Christ, and Son of God, he's evoking that messianic royal tradition. There's a coming Davidic Messiah who's going to rescue Israel and bring about the fruition of all of God's plans. And that's happening in Jesus. And of course, he describes this event with the word gospel, euangelion in Greek. And in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, cognates of the word euangelion occur 4 times in Isaiah, in the second half of Isaiah. And in all four cases that term is used to describe the restoration of Israel, that Israel finds itself in exile, but God is going to one day come back and restore and rescue all of Israel from the consequences of their sin. And so this word evangelion denotes that eschatological salvation. Now, I think there are also Greco-Roman resonances with this term, but when the writers of the New Testament employ this term, particularly the gospel writers, they're generally drawing on this tradition from the Greek translation of Isaiah. So gospel, good news, evangelion. This is the good news, the gospel that God is going to rescue Israel. And Mark is saying that this is happening in and through Jesus. Now, the very first word in Greek in Mark's gospel is arche, and that word is translated in English translations, the beginning. And I've known this for a long time, but it wasn't apparent to me why this was so significant. There are a lot of commentators who suggest that by opening up his gospel this way, Mark is kind of evoking the language of creation in Genesis. Because again, in the Greek translation of Genesis, in the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament, that word arche, or a cognate of that word, is used in the creation narrative in Genesis chapter 1. And so there are a lot of commentators that have drawn that connection. Well, it seems like if Mark is talking about, he's using language from the Old Testament, like Christ, like Son of God, like evangelion, all of which denote these great acts of God on behalf of his people, then why could that term arche at the beginning of Mark not be an allusion to Genesis? And I don't really know how I didn't really know how I felt about that. I think that's a very plausible theory. But essentially what he says here is that maybe using that term arche is tying in with Genesis. But then as soon as Mark says this, he goes right into John the Baptist. So for Mark, the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, it starts with John the Baptist in his proclamation of one coming after him, who is going to be this kind of messianic figure who will baptize people with fire. And so with the Gospel of Mark, the first of these written Gospels, the gospel, the announcement of Jesus Christ begins with John the Baptist. Now, there may be a subtle allusion, like I said, and like many commentators have noted, to the creation narrative in Genesis, but it's certainly not explicit. And for Mark, this good news, the story of Jesus and his gospel, begins with, even though it's based on everything that's happened in the Old Testament as the introduction has alluded to, it begins, his story does, with John the Baptist. This is the beginning of the good news of Jesus, and that's where Mark, the first gospel, ends it. So you can see that the beginning, even if there is an attachment to Genesis, starts with John, because John is the one that announces the coming of Jesus and the coming kingdom of God. Now, based on the Farrer theory and on Barker's theory of synoptic trajectories, Matthew is going to use Mark as a source, and he's going to develop many of the themes that he finds in Mark. So what do we see Matthew doing with this idea of the beginning? Now, what Matthew does that's different than Mark is he does have this kind of brilliant opening statement. The first line in Matthew reads, "The record of the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham." Okay, so already right here, Matthew has told us that he is going to open up his gospel with a genealogy. And a genealogy is, of course, like kind of a long list of hereditary figures. How do you go through a family history of someone to see how far back that goes? We all know what a genealogy is, right? It's tracing a family line from one person to another person at a different point in history. But we can already see in Matthew's opening statement that what Mark has made implicit in his opening statement about Jesus's messianic identity, calling him Christ and Son of God, which goes back to David and that Davidic imagery. Matthew's going to take that a step further. So he says that Jesus is the Messiah, which is exactly what Mark says, that he's the son of David. Mark uses different terms, but Matthew is employing the exact same concept in this passage. And then he goes all the way back to Abraham. So it doesn't just begin with John the Baptist, and then is kind of connected through titles to David and the promised king. Matthew goes even further than that and says, John the Baptist is obviously a very important person, and obviously David is kind of like the central figure in all this, but it starts even before that. It goes all the way back to Abraham, and of course the next several verses in Matthew are this long genealogy that starts with Abraham, and it traces Jesus's lineage all the way from Abraham through David, all the way down to his father Joseph, who is on David's side, which is where Jesus inherits his messianic identity. And then, of course, just a couple of passages after that, you have Mary receiving, well, it's not Mary. And this one, Joseph, is actually in Matthew. What's funny about this, too, and I know I'm getting sidetracked here, but I think this is important. In Matthew's version of the infancy narratives, really his story focuses on Joseph, whereas in Luke, it focuses more on Mary. But in Matthew, just a couple of verses after this genealogy, which is kind of it's structured in a very literary and poetic way to make the point that the line from Jesus runs through both David and Abraham. There's going to be an angel that appears to Joseph and promises that Joseph's fiance Mary is going to conceive a child that was basically given to her by the Holy Spirit. I'm trying to use language that that is appropriate for children that might be listening if you're hearing this in the car, right? So essentially what we have here is that Matthew has taken the beginning of Mark, where Mark clearly connects Jesus to David and then says that it all kind of begins with John the Baptist announcing him in the wilderness. And we can see that Matthew's already pushed that back. Well, it doesn't just go back to David. Now it goes all the way back to Abraham, and very clearly so. And it doesn't begin with John the Baptist. It actually begins with Joseph and Mary, the parents of Jesus. So we can see that Matthew has taken these ideas in Mark and pushed them back a little bit further. The beginning of this entire story about Jesus is taken back a little bit further. So Matthew has taken a concept, a theme, a set of themes that he found in Mark, and he's further elaborated and developed those. Again, it's completely consistent with the Christology of Mark. Matthew believes that Jesus is the Davidic Messiah, full stop, but he's developing that. He's explicitly connecting it to Abraham, and he's also saying, well, Jesus's mother was conceived by the Holy Spirit, or Jesus was conceived in his mother by the Holy Spirit, which is not included in Matthew. So from the standpoint of kind of like not just a royal relationship to God through the line of David, but maybe also even an ontological, a physical relationship to God through Jesus's mother, Mary, we can see how Matthew's developed that idea. So the beginning for Matthew goes back even further and becomes more developed than it is in Mark's. This is a clear example of this synoptic trajectory. And then if we take a look at Luke, which again, based on the FAR theory, uses both Matthew and Mark as a source, Luke is going to do the exact same thing. He's going to push this narrative back even further. Now, Luke does not have the same introduction as does Mark and Matthew. Instead, Luke introduces his gospel. His intended audience, whether it's an individual or a group of people that he's given a nickname to, is Theophilus. And the first 4 verses of Luke's gospel are a note to Theophilus about how and why he wrote his gospel. But it's not long after that Luke immediately jumps into the infancy narratives, and he uses all of this language that's present in Mark and Matthew. So he's using not just language, but he's also using quotations from the Old Testament as well. So he's using the language of the gospel. He's talking about Joseph being a descendant of David. He's talking about how the Lord is going to give the throne to his father David, and this coming son is going to reign over the house of Jacob forever, and his kingdom will have no end. They quote a lot of the same passages. Luke quotes a lot, and I say they. Luke quotes a lot of the same passages that Mark and Matthew do when it comes to John the Baptist being a forerunner, the guy who kind of foretells the coming Messiah. And then, of course, you have Mary very explicitly being given a child by the Holy Spirit. So again, in the infancy narratives in Luke, Luke is saying everything that Mark and Matthew said, but only intensifying it. He's making these more subtle or less developed ideas in Mark and Matthew more explicit, and all they do is elevate the Christology of Jesus, both Jesus's messianic Davidic Christology, both the idea that he is king and king over the entire world, and also the idea that his relationship to God might be a little bit more than just kind of like a kingly representative here on earth, that there's an actual substantial physical relationship to God, an ontological relationship, and Luke has just developed that. Now, Luke very famously has a genealogy that he does not give until the end of chapter 4, or that he does not give until chapter 4, that is different than the genealogy that was given, I'm sorry, the end of chapter 3 rather, that was given at the very beginning of Matthew. So obviously Luke has taken Matthew's genealogy, he's moved it to a different part of his gospel, and he's reworked some of the details in that genealogy. But the point that Luke makes that Matthew doesn't is, while Matthew's genealogy starts with Abraham and goes to Jesus, because Matthew is trying to develop all of these messianic concepts in Mark, Luke goes back even further. He's already in his infancy narratives heightened the ontological relationship between Jesus and God the Father, and he's going to go back even beyond Abraham. So in Luke chapter 3, verses 23 through 38, Luke's genealogy begins with Jesus, and it goes all the way back, not just to Abraham, but to Adam, who is called the Son of God. So Luke is going all the way back to the first man, all right, Adam, the first man in the garden, who is called specifically in Luke's genealogy. This is Luke 3:38, the Son of God. So you can see how this synoptic trajectory works. Whereas for Mark, he has this presentation of Jesus, Davidic Messiah, by using the word arche there. There's maybe this connection to Genesis, but the ministry of Jesus is kind of, the story, the gospel of Jesus, even though it is rooted in the Old Testament, it begins with John. In Matthew, he's pushed all that back further. He's pushed back the identity of Jesus to Mary, who is conceived by the Holy Spirit. And in his genealogy, Jesus doesn't just go back to David, he goes back to Abraham as well, intensifying, heightening what Mark had said. And Luke does the same thing. It's not just Abraham. Yes, it is Abraham. That's very important. And yes, Jesus is the Davidic Messiah. That's also very important. And yes, obviously Mary is conceived of the Holy Spirit, but both through his infancy narrative and his genealogy, he traces these ideas even further. Jesus becomes related to Adam, the son of God, just as his portrayal of Mary's conception is even more vivid, heightening that ontological relationship between Jesus and the Father. So we can see that Luke has taken these ideas in Matthew and Mark and developed them even further. The beginning of the gospel, where it starts, the Christological identity of Jesus, it's not different from Mark and Matthew. It's just more developed. There's more nuance, and it goes back even further and further. And this is where the Gospel of John finally comes in. Based on Barker's theory, where John is rewriting the Synoptic Gospels, that he knows the Synoptic Gospels, but he's employing this ancient literary and rhetorical technique called oppositio and ementato, where he is creatively reworking his source material in a way that is completely consistent in substance, even though it differs in style from the original material. And we can see how this works out with John's Christological development. Now, John very famously opens his gospel by alluding to the creation narrative in Genesis and by drawing a straight line from Jesus to the creation, which means that Jesus has an even more developed connection to God the Father than he did in the Synoptic Gospels. And so the very first lines of John are this. It's famous, you probably all know it, but it's worth hearing it. It says, "In the beginning was the Word." There's that word beginning again. It's the exact same, or a cognate of the same word that Mark used to describe the beginning at the start of his gospel. So John says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and apart from him, nothing came into being that has come into being. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it." And then it talks about John the Baptist. So you can see here, all right, this isn't really that much different than what Luke has done with Matthew and Mark, except that John just takes Luke one step further. Whereas Mark kind of starts with David, the Old Testament, and John the Baptist. Matthew has pushed that back to Abraham and Mary. Luke has intensified the story of Mary's conception and pushed it back to Adam. And John takes the obvious logical next step and pushes it back to creation altogether, identifying Jesus with the Father, that Jesus had a hand in creation. He was there with God in the beginning when he created the heavens and the earth. And if the theory that a lot of commentators of Mark have, or if the theory that a lot of commentators of Mark have is true. Am I saying that the right way? That sounds wrong. The theory that term RK in Mark that a lot of commentators have, there it is a much better way of saying it. If that theory is true and John understands that connection, well, then it makes a lot of sense that he's just developing the raw material that was already there in Mark. So while yes, this is a big difference stylistically, and it's a huge development over what Mark has said, it's not really that it's not that different from it. I mean, it is different from it, but it's not discontent. There's no discontinuity there. John is just making explicit what is already implicit in Mark. And this is the theory of synoptic trajectories running from Mark all the way through John. And what's interesting about that is that there have been some scholars that have said that John kind of downplays the messianic identity of Jesus, but like just a couple of verses after this beautiful introduction in John, where Jesus is said to be present at the creation of the world, a couple of Jewish leaders come to John the Baptist and ask him who he is. And John says, I'm not the Christ, right? Like, I'm not the Messiah. I testify to the Messiah, but I'm not the Messiah. John himself says that grace and truth were realized through Jesus Christ. And the very first disciples of Jesus, when they see him, they say, this is verse 41 of John chapter 1, we have found the Messiah, which translated means Christ. So yes, John has clearly developed an ontological relationship between Jesus and God the Father that was implicit in Mark and then kind of slowly developed through Matthew and Luke. But he's not saying anything that's fundamentally different. He's not contradicting them. He's just developing them. But John also hasn't forgotten that Jesus is the Messiah of Israel, that he is literally the king and the king over all of creation. It's just that John chooses to characteristically emphasize that unique relationship between Jesus and the Father that is more implied and less developed in the Synoptic Gospels. And I think that if you take a look at the cumulative data between all four of them, and you also look at how this fits into both the Farrer theory and to Barker's theory of synoptic trajectories, then it all makes a lot of sense. And the supposed contradictions between the gospels are really only contradictions in style, not contradictions in substance. They all kind of believe the same thing about Jesus. It's just that these ideas kind of get slowly developed over time. Now, some of this will depend, as I said at the beginning of the show, on how you date the letters to Paul. I think that there's good evidence to suggest that the Gospel of Mark, at least, was probably written a lot earlier than 70, which, there are a lot of scholars that postulate that because of Mark 13 and the prediction of the destruction of the temple, that Mark could not have been written until after the temple was destroyed by the Romans in AD 70. But there's kind of a scholarly, it's not a consensus, but there's a large number of scholars that have turned against that and have suggested that Mark might have been written at the same time that Paul was writing his Gospels. And as we know from, or as Paul was writing his letters, rather, and as we know from Paul's letters, Paul certainly Paul believes that Jesus is the Messiah, without a doubt, the King of Israel, the rightful king of the entire world. But Paul also pushes that Christological language to its absolute limits. Like, Paul does not articulate a full-blown doctrine of the Trinity in the same way that the Niceno-Constantinopolitan creeds of the 4th century do. However, he does lay all of the foundations for that belief to be developed, right? So we can see, again, talking about trajectories, you can see a trajectory from Paul to those creeds. The creeds don't contradict what Paul or they don't contradict what Paul says. They just develop what he's not fully fleshed out in his letters. And I actually kind of think that it's consistent with the Synoptic Gospels. And there are other reasons why I think that Paul and the Gospels overlap in a lot of thematic ways that we'll talk about on a different show. But the point of all of this really is just that I can't, it can't be overstated enough. And we can't say this enough, that for the writers of the New Testament, when they refer to Jesus using these heightened Christological terms, whether it's Christ, whether it's Son of Man, whether it's Son of David, whether it's Son of God, whether it's the infancy narratives where Mary is conceived by the Holy Spirit, whether it's the Gospel of John, where Jesus is identified with God and was present at the creation of the entire world, or with Luke, where Jesus's genealogy goes back to the Son of Man. No matter what we make of all of that, the New Testament gives us a unified picture of Jesus as the universal king, that he rules over all creation and that all of creation must submit to him and will, in the end, at the consummation of the kingdom, finally bow the knee to Jesus, who was, and this is, this is Philippians 2, 5 through 11 again. Paul talks about how Jesus was in the form of God, but then emptied himself and became obedient, taking on the form of a man. And it's for that reason that God highly exalted him and that every knee will bow and every tongue confess that he is Lord, right? So there's that dynamic at play as well between Jesus's Christological identity in the sense of him being the Davidic Messiah, and also the fact that there is some sort of ontological relationship between Jesus and God that even the prophets didn't quite predict, or they didn't quite predict in the way that we start seeing it developed in the New Testament. And that I believe that throughout the New Testament, Paul and the Gospels in particular, that they speak with a unified voice about the nature of Jesus's messianic and Christological identity, even if the language and categories are developed over time. We can't forget that. So I hope that this kind of romp through the trajectories in the Synoptic Gospels, the Gospel of John, and then kind of tying that into Paul, I hope that it helps you better understand how the kind of two different Christological elements of Jesus, kind of two different Christological streams, the Davidic Christology and then the divine Christology, come together, and that's all present in the New Testament. And there have been, I would say, not there have been, but I would say that throughout much of Christian history, we have kind of downplayed or ignored the Davidic elements, because in a lot of ways, it's safer for Christians to just believe that Jesus was God, and that's all that Christological relation, or that's all that Christological language refers to. Because once you start getting into the idea that Jesus is the Davidic Messiah, well, then that changes the way that you have to understand political power and the nature of the political process and the nature of leaders and states and laws and human relationships. Like, it impacts the way that we relate to every other human being. So obviously the divine Christology is incredibly consequential, and we can't divide that at all from the Davidic Christology. But we can't also emphasize Jesus's divine Christology at the expense of his Davidic Christology. And it's pretty easy to see that the writers of the New Testament don't do that, that they can hold both, that they can and actually do hold both of those things together. And intellectually, you really can't make sense of Jesus's divine Christology without his Davidic Christology. And his Davidic Christology is only heightened and made even greater by the ontological Christology, which is also developed throughout the New Testament, and to which later Christians would find even more formal development and articulation of in the creeds. So again, I wanted to present all of that to you today. This is something that's been bouncing around my head, but all of this goes back to the basic idea that Jesus is the Messiah, and that we should all accept that, and that this is a real messiahship. It's not just a spiritual thing. It's not just a confession that he's God in some sort of abstract sense. It's real, and it matters, and there are consequences to this that we've been talking about on this show a lot, and that we'll continue to develop. So I appreciate you guys hanging around with me today through all of my getting overheated in my wife's office and having to stop the stream and restart it. So thank you guys for that. If you're listening on the podcast feed, I'll try to edit this a little bit so it's not as awkward for you. But thank you guys so much for listening to these episodes. I know that I don't have the biggest podcast following in the world, but for those of you guys that listen week in and week out, you really do make a huge difference. Like, it's incredible to be able to get on here and share these ideas. And even more important than that, it's not really about me. It's so incredibly humbling and exciting knowing that there are other people out there that care about these ideas, that think that these ideas are important, that would take 45 minutes out of their week to listen to someone that they might have never met in person talk about these big ideas, and that want to find ways of serving Jesus and building the church and building the kingdom in ways that people haven't thought about necessarily, or in ways that have often been marginalized in Christian history. So you guys are awesome. I really appreciate you doing this. Like I said, working hard on this book. Hopefully this thing will come out. I'm trying to get it done by the winter of 2026. So we're looking at January, February. I would love to have the manuscript complete, start getting edited, and maybe have it out by next spring or next summer. We'll see if any of this happens, but I'm going to keep on working on this. In the meantime, Please, if you haven't, subscribe over on YouTube. I got blackballed the moment I got on there for some episodes I did on COVID a long time ago. So if you can help with my shadow banning and go over and subscribe, that would be great. Thank you for that. Follow me on Twitter at ProLibertyPod. Go to libertarianchristians.com/shop or store and buy some Protestant Libertarian podcast merch. Hopefully we'll get some more of that. Again, I would love to be able to build an office where I could have my own fan system and keep it as cold as I wanted to at all times of the year. And you can help me do that by buying some merch and supporting me. So thank you guys for everything you do. I love you all, and I will see you next Tuesday. Have a good week.